and indeed, I had a look at your YouTube channel actually, and it's my honor to share it with Rabbi Wein. Certainly, it's an honor for me to be together with Rabbi Wein, who is extremely important Rav here in Yerushalayim, and I've known him, a good friend of mine for so many years, and it's nice to be able to share it with him. Like we shared, if you remember, we shared Hanukkah in Eilat last year when life was still somewhat normal, and we had a time. Please God, we will renew our joint projects. At the moment, we are jointly connected on Eli's YouTube channel, and that's where these shiurim are available. So, as I say, obviously we are all preparing for Rosh Hashanah, and I'd like to have a look at some maybe more hidden ideas and deeper ideas in our davening and in our general mindset. I think I mentioned you before, but I'll mention it again. The impact of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur depends very often on the way in which we are prepared for it. If you just fall straight into it, it's very difficult to get into the understanding and to get into the mindset of the Yomim Noraim without preparations, and that's the point, the objective of this shir. Maybe I'll start off with a very interesting comment which is found in the Rishonim, particularly in the Sefer HaChinuch. I tried to get the text up on the screen, but I couldn't get hold of the text this morning. But I'll just tell it to you, Torah Shabbal Peh. The Sefer HaChinuch writes something very beautiful. He says that the idea of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that we have, if you like, an annual judgment, or what might be called an annual audit of our spiritual state by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then on Yom Kippur we get, if we have had thoughts of tshuva and plans of tshuva, we get a forgiveness. The Sefer HaChinuch writes that this process is nothing less than the secret of the eternal survival of the Jewish people. There is a concept of Netzach Yisrael. Netzach Yisrael means the indestructibility of Klal Yisrael, which is a very fascinating idea, given the fact there have been lots of nations and cultures and languages that have risen and fallen over the millennia. No one speaks anymore ancient Akkadian or ancient Egyptian or ancient Persian. They're all modern countries have been taken over time and time again, and lots of cultures and nations have disappeared from the world. But Klal Yisrael have got a promise from HaKadosh Baruch Hu of Netzach Yisrael, of the eternity and the indestructibility of Klal Yisrael, despite all attempts to the contrary, despite all the anti-Semitism and the pogroms and the inquisitions and the hatreds. Nevertheless, Klal Yisrael have been promised that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will not abandon Klal Yisrael. That pasuk incidentally is taken from this morning's Hayom Yom Revi B'Shabbos. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises us not to abandon Klal Yisrael under any circumstances. Says the Sefer HaChinuch, what's the secret? What's the secret of the eternity of Klal Yisrael? He says, from a spiritual point of view, nations of the world have, over the centuries, accumulated so much, if you like, negative, so many negative averos of various sorts, that they have been doomed, spiritually doomed. Klal Yisrael have been given an annual audit in order to have an annual, if you like, to clear out the averos and the negativity from Klal Yisrael. And therefore, we start with a new slate every year. We're able to start again fresh. And therefore, as a nation, we never reach a point where Klal Yisrael, Chas v'Shalom, have lost their right to exist in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's eyes, this annual judgment is a way of preserving the eternal strength of the Jewish people, and in a sense, it's a way of returning and guaranteeing the idea that eventually there will be a redemption. I mentioned to you last year, I looked at it last week in the Shia, we looked at Parshas Nitzavim. And we saw in Parshas Nitzavim that HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises us, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will eventually gather in the exiles from all four corners of the world, as we have seen in our generation, and will bring a Geula. But how can that be guaranteed? So the Sefer HaChinuch wants to suggest that the guarantee that eventually there will be a Geula, the guarantee that Klal Yisrael will not disappear from the world of nations, is this time of year. This time of year gives us the ability that we don't accumulate too much, so to speak, debt. If you have an annual audit and every year you clear up your debts and you resolve your debts, then you never accumulate too much of a heavy burden. And that is a very fascinating aspect. And it's a beautiful aspect of the significance of this time of year. And I'd like to show you a very beautiful indication of this in our davening. That's the first text we're going to be looking at. And this idea comes from the Shlo HaKadosh. The Shlo HaKadosh of Yeshaya Halevi Horovitz, one of the great Mekubalim in the 16th century, one of the great minds and leaders of Klal Yisrael in Europe. And he's called the Shlo because his magnum opus was a set of books called the Shnei Luchot Habrit, Shin Lamed Hey. Shin Lamed Hey is the Shlo HaKadosh, and it's also an acronym of Yeshaya Halevi Horovitz. The three letters, Shin Lamed Hey, also refer to his name. That's what people used to do in naming their works in earlier times. And I'd like to show you something fascinating from a piece of tefillah that everybody recognizes. So let's do a bit of a... okay, so there is can you see, Ellie, can you see a text? Good, excellent. Always good to check whether the texts are coming through or not. So there is a phrase that we're all familiar with from our davening. At the beginning of every single Shemona Esrei, doesn't matter if it's Shabbos or Yom Tov, in our tefillah we have these four words: Melech, Ozer, Umoshia, Umogen. I can see I've written this wrong. I've left out. Right, very good. Melech, Ozer, Umoshia, Umogen. Let's have a look. Everyone knows this text, of course. We start off our tefillah by, so to speak, introducing ourselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that our visiting card, so to speak, before we daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is that we lay claim. Our claim is that we are descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, right? We then go on to use the words Okeil, Hagodal, Hagibah, Hanora, which are words taken from Sefer Devarim that Moshe Rabbeinu uses to describe HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then we have another phrase, Keil Elyon, which doesn't come from Moshe Rabbeinu, but comes actually from Malki Tzedek Melech Sholem. That's a different story completely. And then we say, Gomel Chasodim Tevim, that whatever we're asking from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we're not asking because we deserve it. We're asking because we rely on Chasdei Hashem, on the generosity and the kindness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Kone Hakol, reference to God as the creator, right? And then V'zoche Chasdei Avos, that we are relying on Chasdei Avot, that the great actions of our Avos. And then we say something very interesting. We say that we know Mevi Geula V'nei V'neihem Man Shemo Ba'ah, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will bring a redeemer. I think we need to mute people again, Ellie, if you don't mind. We need to do another bit of muting because I'm getting some background noises. Some of you might have noticed, incidentally, I've moved to the kitchen because my Wi-Fi signal in the kitchen is much stronger than in my study. So you have a background of my kitchen, not quite as inspirational as the background of my study, but more effective. The kitchen is usually a good place to do important activities in any house anyway. So that's where I am at the moment. So in our davening, we make reference to the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Mevi Goyel Livnei V'neiha. That we've been promised that there will be a moment of, this is a reference to Mashiach. This is a reference to the Geula, to the ingathering of the exiles, the return to the land of Israel, right? Then we add in this bit, which isn't actually my topic at the moment, but since we're going to start saying it on Friday night, we're going to start saying this, and we're going to say it for 10 days. It's worthwhile getting it back into your short-term memory. Zachreinu l'chaim, melech hafetz b'chaim. This is a special tefillah inserted already here at the beginning of every Shemona Esrei during the 10 days of Aseret Yemei Tshuva. Start saying it on Rosh Hashanah. The idea being that, of course, on Rosh Hashanah we are all davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're all davening for Kosveinu b'Sefer HaChaim. That the books, so to speak, the audit is open, and we wish to be inscribed in the Sefer HaChaim. And I have mentioned to you before, but it's worth mentioning again when you say this tefillah, that the word Chaim doesn't only mean, in Lashon HaKodesh, in Hebrew, doesn't just mean life as opposed to death. But Chaim refers to eternal life. Chaye Olam, not Abasachenu. Right? Chaye Olam is a reference to life beyond this world. It's a reference to Olam Haba. I think I mentioned to you that this is actually coded into the word Chaim. Right? The word Chaim, I mean, the adjective is Chai. Right? The noun is Chaim. But why does Hebrew choose the word Chaim, which is actually a plural form? The word, the grammatical form ayim, right, like einayim, oznayim, raglayim, doesn't mean, when you speak about raglayim, you don't mean lots of legs, you just mean two legs, you mean a pair of legs. When you speak about misparayim, you don't mean many different cutting edges, just two of them, right? And raglayim and michnasayim, whenever you have a pair of things which only work well together, right? Misparayim only work because the two blades work together. And Michnasayim only work because they've got two parts to cover both legs. And Einayim and Oznayim, whenever you have the Ayim end, it means a dual form which actually makes for one functional entity. That is the idea of this grammatical form. And that's also true about Chayim. Chayim itself contains this deeper meaning, that it's talking about two different types of life, of Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba. So we're davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not just that we should, Be'ezus Hashem, live a long and healthy life in this world and to be alive in the physical sense of the world, but also we're looking for Chayim, right? The Chaye Olam, that we should indeed deserve to be a Ben Olam Haba. We should have a life where we know that we have that life continues beyond this world into Olam Haba, that the neshama, the eternal neshama, doesn't end when the body's life ends. And that's all in the word Chaim, and that's in our tefillah. In fact, I'm not sure if I've mentioned this to you before, but it's worth mentioning again, that the additions that we make at the beginning of davening use the word Chaim, right? The additions that we make at the end of the Shemona Esrei, we speak about Chaim Tovim. Not Chaim, but Chaim Tovim. And there are different, so sometimes we say Chaim and sometimes Chaim Tovim. And the Arizal writes that when we say Chaim Tovim, we're talking about this worldly life in essence. But Chaim in essence means Olam Haba. And if you look actually in Parshas, in Vayikra, when the Pasuk says, in Parshas Achremos, the Pasuk says, Asher yaseh osam ha'odam v'chai bohem, that you must do the mitzvahs v'chai bohem, that by performing mitzvahs you will attain life. So Rashi says, v'chai bohem b'olam haba, In other words, the simple reference in the Torah to the word chayim is eternal life. It also means this worldly life. And our tefillos and Rosh Hashanah have to encompass both types of life, this world and the next world, and that's part of our Kabbalah. But then we go on to say this phrase, and that's what I want to look at for a few minutes this morning. Melech Ozer Umoshia Umoge. So what do? We're using 4 different titles, so to speak, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're addressing the Almighty, and we're saying that you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, are a Melech, right? You are the ultimate king. Ozer means you assist us. Ezra, right? Right? Ezra Rishonah, right? His first aid. Ozer is an assistant, right? You assist us. Moshiach means salvation, right? The honor Hashem Hoshiana is to save us, and Mogain is protecting. It means a layer of protection, right? And Magen actually means literally a shield. So Melech Ozer Moshiach Mogain is a very fascinating phrase, giving these 4 descriptions to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Says the Shloh HaKadosh. So the Shloh HaKadosh says that these 4 words were chosen because we want to, every time we stand in Tefillah, we want to reconnect to the month of Tishri. Every year we have a month of Tishri, and the month of Tishri is the month in which we get spiritually recharged. We recharge our batteries during Rosh Hashanah and Kippur Sukkot. So he says as follows: Melech, the word Melech is a reference to Rosh Hashanah, because it is the most frequently recurring word on Rosh Hashanah, right? The Shliach Tzibur starts davening, not with Shochen Ad, but he starts with HaMelech, right? And we say, don't say, okay, HaKadosh, we say HaMelech HaKadosh, HaMelech HaMishpat. And in the bracha, we don't say Mekadesh Yisrael v'Yom HaZikaron, we say bracha to Hashem, Melech HaKol Yisrael, Mekadesh Yisrael v'Yom HaZikaron. The word Melech comes again and again, and we've discussed it in the previous shir. What Melech means here, that it connects actually to the first moments of Adam HaRishon, in the very first Yom HaShishi, that he recognized Malchus Shemayim. He was the first creature to recognize HaKadosh Baruch Hu as the Melech HaOlam. And every Rosh Hashanah is an anniversary of, so to speak, the creation of Malchus. So if Melech is Rosh Hashanah, Ozer, says the Shloh HaKadosh, is a reference to the Aseres Yemei Teshuvah. Because the Aseres Yemei Teshuvah, the days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, also have particular significance in the eyes of Chazal, right? So Chazal say that when Yeshaya HaNavi said, Dirshu Hashem bihi motzo, kra'uhu biyoso korov, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is particularly close. Of course, it doesn't mean he's close, it means he's more accessible to us, and that we can get closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When is that? Says the Gemara, that's between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, ben keser le'osor. That's the phrase, the poetic phrase used, which appears in the Slichas, ben keser le'osor. Keser means literally, where does the word keser come from? Anybody know where the word keser comes from? It's the Pasuk in Tehillim, which says, Tiku b'chodesh shofar b'keser liyom chagei. The day of the shofar is called the keser. It's called the hidden day. In many ways, Rosh Hashanah has many aspects of it which are hidden. Not the least of which, incidentally, is the one I mentioned a few weeks ago, is that the very essence of the Yom Hadin, it is a day of judgment, is hidden in the Chumash. In the Chumash, it's not written explicitly, it just says Yom Teruah. It's only in the Mishnah we hear for the first time that it is a day of judgment, and we hear it in the Tehillim. Tiku b'chodesh shofar b'keser liyom chageinu ki chok liYisrael hu mishpat l'elokei Yaakov. That it's a day of judgment that's hidden, right? So the Rosh Hashanah is the keser, but Aseres Yemei Teshuvah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Ozer. He's assisting us if a person wishes to do tshuva, meaning to improve one's life, to make spiritual improvements, to resolve to live a better Jewish life in some way or another, in terms of davening or learning or chesed or mitzvahs or whatever. Ozer is the 10 days in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Moshiach, he says, is Yom Kippur itself, because it's a day of Yeshua. Yom Kippur refers to the day when HaKadosh Baruch Hu actually, if we have followed the Rosh Hashanah and Aseret Tshuva, it's a day of Ki Bayom Hazeh Yechaper Aleichem L'Taher Eschem, a day when the slate is wiped clean. We are given Kapara and Mechila, and that is a salvation. So the Moshiach is Yom Kippur, and what is Mogain? So Mogain, says the Shalah, is the Sukkah. The Sukkah is Mogain, the Schach of the Sukkah, protects us, right? I'm not going to, please God, I'll give some shiurim on Sukkahs, about Sukkahs. But the symbolic concept of the Schach is that it protects us from danger, from damage, from spiritual damage, and the mitzvah of the Sukkah, the Schach, is the Mogain. So basically he says, and this is a very fascinating thing, and I must say I think about this during the year quite often when I'm davening Shemona Esrei, Melech Ozel Moshiach or Mogain connects us to the month of Tishri. And every year, the month of Tishri provides us with a series of days which have the ability to spiritually recharge our batteries, so that for the whole year, we are, in a sense, once again able to function spiritually. And it comes about because of Melech, Ozer, Moshiach, Mogain, that these four words. I find this a very beautiful and very powerful insight. And it just shows you that the words of our davening, how carefully chosen they have been. Right? The Gemara in Megillah says that the words of our Shemona Esrei were put together by the Anshe Knesses Hagdolah, which was the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, the time of, and which included the Nevi'im, Chagai, Zachariah, and Malachi, and all the Gedolei Yisrael of that time got together and they authored this text. So every word is done was weighed carefully, and it was written with levels, different levels of meaning. And here I think the Shema HaKadosh has given us a glimpse of these important words. Melech, Ozer, Moshiach, Mogain. I'd just like to mention two things about this. First of all, if you followed what I said before in the name of the Sefer Chinuch, that the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are really the secret of the existence, the eternal existence of Klal Yisrael, and our confidence that Mashiach will indeed arrive, that the Geula will come. So then you can see a very interesting connection here, because what do we say immediately before Melech Ozer Mashiach Mogain? We say Umevi Goel Livnei V'nei Hevnaman Shmo Ba'ava. We say in Shemona Esrei that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will bring a redeemer, right? He will bring the Mashiach. How do we know? So the Shlach HaKadosh would say, how can we be so certain that there will be a Geula? How can we be so certain that the Jewish people will not simply dissolve, disintegrate, assimilate, lose their mission, lose their understanding, lose their Torah over the millennia? How do we know that? The answer is Melech Ozer Moshiach Mogain. The answer is the annual audit and the annual recharge that we get from Rosh Hashanah, Aseret Tshuva, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. That is the key, says the Sefer Chinuch. That's the key to our certainty that of the eternity of Klal Yisrael. And this is a very, very beautiful and powerful idea, which I think, if one reflects on it a bit and thinks about it, should raise one's awareness of what Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are really all about. And it's possibly not by chance, if I've understood correctly this part of the Tefillah, it's not by chance that the very first insertion that we have during these 10 days comes between these two words. That the Zochreinu L'Chaim that was inserted in the Shemona Esrei is dafka inserted here between the reference to the Goyel, which is here, right? The Geula, the promise of the Geula is here, and the Chodesh Tishri is here. And between this and that, we get the Zochreinu L'Chaim, because this is the place in which there is a hidden reference to exactly this time of year. Incidentally, the whole idea of adding in a tefillah at this point in the davening, Zachrei was very hotly disputed among the Rishonim, because in the Gemara itself, there is no reference to Zachreinu L'chaim. I don't know if you're aware of this. These additions of Zachreinu L'chaim and Micha Mocha Ava Rachamim don't appear anywhere in the Gemara. Right? That, incidentally, is the reason for the halacha that if you forget them, you don't repeat the Shemona Esrei, because we only repeat the Shemona Esrei if you forget things that are mentioned in the Gemara, like HaMelech HaKadosh is mentioned in the Gemara. So if you forget that, you have to repeat the Shemona Esrei. But Zachreinu L'chaim and B'Sefer Chaim Bracha B'Shalom, these additions, because they're not mentioned in the Gemara, you don't have to repeat the Shemona Esrei if you forget them. So when they were authored much later, the time of the Gaonim, of Amram Gaon, of Sadia Gaon, and they were heavily debated, because there were those who claim that we don't insert any requests in the first three brachas or the last three brachas of the Shemona Esrei, only in the middle. And the first three brachas are meant to simply be praised by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? So what is the argument to allow additions to the tefillah in the first three, in the beginning of the davening? And the argument given was, it's true we don't usually do it, but this time of year it's pikuach nefesh. This time of year we are davening for our lives. It is our lives and the lives of Klal Yisrael, the lives of our family and our loved ones which are at stake. And therefore this principle of not davening in the first three brachas is set aside. And we do mention, in fact, Zachreinu L'chaim, Melech Chofetz B'chaim, a very, very beautiful and succinct tefillah. Okay, so I hope I've added a little bit to your davening. When you spare a thought when you're davening on Friday night and on Shabbos morning and on Rosh Hashanah for this sequence of ideas. The sequence, it's a three-level sequence. It starts here with the reference to the Goel, a reference to the promise for a Mashiach, for a redemption. It goes on to ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu for Zachreinu L'chaim, that we should be remembered for life in this world and the next. And it ends up by saying that our guarantee for it is these four words, Melech, Ozer, Mashiach, Mogain, which is the month of Tishri, Rosh Hashanah, Aseret Shmei Tshuva, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. There it is, ladies and gentlemen, coded into every Shemona Esrei, something to think about. The next thing I want to have a look with you, let me just go through here for a second, remind myself what I want to have a look. This year we have something that we occasionally have, which is Rosh Hashanah falling on Shabbos. And because Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos, we don't have the shofar. And in many communities, we don't say tashlich either. If it's Shabbos, we wait till the second day. That's already a question of minhag. That's not a thing, but that's what I learned. Anyhow, that's not the point. One thing is clear in halacha, which is that on Shabbos we don't have the shofar, and this is a little bit surprising. Let's just talk about that for one moment. It is a little. I think it's a bit shocking, the idea that Chazal. This was a piece of legislation which is not found in the Chumash, which is not even found in the Mishnah. It's a piece of legislation from the time of the Talmud, from the 4th, 5th century, that the Chachamim decided that when it's Shabbos, no shofar. Shofar is cancelled. And this is quite extraordinary. Why might this be so? So whenever Chazal instituted rabbinic legislation, there are often sort of many levels of meaning and reasons. It's never for one simple reason. The simple reason given is that because it's Shabbos, we don't want to have a halacha that you must have a shofar, because people might come to carry the shofar. And you might be in a place where there's no Eruv. First of all, being in a place where there's no Eruv is something which nobody should be in anyway, right? Everyone has to live in a town where there's an Eruv, otherwise you're in trouble keeping Shabbos all year round. So, and most towns indeed had an Eruv. And I dedicated 15 years of my life to a battle against the English authorities and a few other strange people in order to have the Eruv established in London. And Baruch Hashem, it's now doing well and has been copied by so many people, copied in Manchester, copied in Edgware, and even as of a month ago, copied in Stamford Hill. Stamford Hill, they decided, only 40 years too late, but it doesn't matter, they decided it's time to have an Eruv, and they put the Eruv, they put up an Eruv in Stamford Hill as well, because everybody understands that without an Eruv, especially if you have small children or whatever, keeping Shabbos is very, very hard. Nevertheless, Chazal understood there will be places where there is no Eruv, right? Or there might be houses which are outside the Eruv. Very often the Eruv didn't encompass the entire town, only encompassed the central part, right? Where to put the perimeter of the Eruv, we spent months tearing our hair out, deciding where to put the perimeter. The perimeter of the Northwest London Eruv was decided on my dining room table over several meetings with Rabbi Shimon Ida and various other Rabbonim. We had maps and other maps and different maps, and would we be able, did we have the patience and the courage to deal with the Hampstead Garden Suburb Trust or not, right? Because they were such an unbelievable pain, and they were absolutely fighting tooth and nail that we wouldn't put up any poles and wires in their Heiliger district, Chas v'Shalom, that next to their holy trees and holy hedges, there should be a pole with a wire on it. So this was one of our biggest battles, the Hampstead Garden Suburb. We almost gave up the whole of Hampstead Garden Suburb because of the trust, but in the end, we won in court. We won them in court, we beat them in court, but they were completely out to destroy the Eruv at all costs, but they were not successful, Baruch Hashem. Why do I mention all this? First of all, I mention it because I'm a bit obsessed with this topic, so whenever the opportunity comes to talk about it, I can't resist. That's the first confession I'd like to make this morning. I'm a little bit obsessed with the whole history of it and the story of it. But the reason why I'm mentioning it is because something's going to happen in 2 days' time, 2 or 3 days' time, which is very strange. And that is we're going to have Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos, and the Torah calls it Yom Teruah, and there's only one mitzvah asay of Rosh Hashanah, which is the blowing of the shofar, and we're not going to do it. We're not going to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. We're not going to blow it. And the Gemara says, why not? Because you might be living in a town where there's no Eruv, and you might come to carry the shofar and violate the Shabbos. So that consideration that you might violate the Shabbos overrides the annual mitzvah of Yom Teruah, of blowing the shofar. And at first sight, this actually doesn't add up in our minds so well. You might say, well, look, let's be careful. Let's be careful not to carry it. Let's be careful to build an Eruv. Let's be careful that we don't carry things. People, the truth is, before we had an Eruv in London, people were extremely careful not to carry. People who were Shomer Shabbos were Shomer Shabbos. In fact, that was our first battle, coming back to my obsession just for a minute. That was my first battle with Barnet Council. We said, look, we want to build an Eruv because people don't carry on Shabbos. They said, we don't believe you that people don't carry on Shabbos. I said, what do you mean we don't carry things? They said, what do you mean, a handkerchief, a pen, your reading glasses, your house keys? You don't carry all these, we don't believe you don't carry these things. You don't push a buggy, you don't push a stroller, we don't believe it. So I said, look, that's the truth. We don't believe it. They didn't believe us that there was a problem of carrying on Shabbos. They thought we looked quite normal. We didn't look like weirdos. You know, our Eruv committee consisted of a couple of scientists, a couple of lawyers, and we were not weird-looking people. You know, and nevertheless. So I said, look, I'd like to invite you to come and stand at the entrance to my shul, any Shabbos of your choice, without giving us advance notice. And you will see that not a single person, man, woman, or child, walks into the shul building carrying anything at all. Right? And apparently they did that. I didn't see them there, but they told me afterwards they did go because they didn't believe. They went to the entrance of Ner Yisrael 1 or 2 weeks of Shabbos, just at random Shabbos, just to check it out. And they saw that not a single person carried a single thing ever into the shul premises. So this was actually an amazing shock to them that seemingly normal civilized people were behaving in a very strange way, not carrying simple objects on Shabbos. But that's Hilchos Shabbos. Hilchos Shabbos right? Mishpotim bal yodo'u. It's difficult to explain to the non-Jewish world how these things work. And in the end, we decided, that's it, you're never going to understand this. We are just, anyhow, I can spend the rest of the share talking about this, but I'm not going to, even though I'd really love to. So we are left with Shabbos in a few days' time without a shofar. But I want to show you something which gives you maybe a bit of a better appreciation in Chazal about why it is indeed that the Chachamim understood that even the slightest risk of Chilul Shabbos overrides the mitzvah of shofar. There's a whole different subject here, is that the Chachamim, that Chazal had the mandate, that they had the authority, if they wished to cancel a mitzvah min HaTorah. The Chachamim had the ability. They didn't have the ability to tell us to violate a prohibition of the Torah. But they did have the possibility, they did have the power to say, this mitzvah has been set aside. We're not going to do this mitzvah under these circumstances. So I want to show you something interesting in Chazal. Let's see if I can find it. Okay, so let's start off with a pasuk in Yeshaya. This, incidentally, is a famous haftorah for every Tanis Tzibur, every public fast day. There's a chapter 55 and 56 of Yeshaya, which starts with the words Dirshu Hashem b'himotzo kra'uhu b'yosa karov Yazav Rosha Darka V'Shem Mashavosav, speaks about tshuva, speaks about HaKadosh Baruch Hu accepting our tefillas and our tshuva. And in the middle of it, Yeshaya says as follows: Kayomar Hashem Shimru Mishpot V'Asu Tzedakah. A general phrase which you find quite often in the Nevi'im, which says observe the mitzvahs. Shimru Mishpot V'Asu Tzedakah. Do what is just, do what is right. Ki karovo Yeshuasa Lavoi, because my redemption is karova, is imminent, right? V'tidkasi lihigolos, and then you will see the righteousness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, and then what Yeshaya does is he singles out one mitzvah above all others. Having said a generic pasuk about all mitzvahs, he says, Ashrei enosh yasezos. Happy is the man who does this. Who does what? Who observes the Torah and the mitzvahs and lives a life of righteousness and integrity and truthfulness, mishpat and tzedakah. And then he says, Asher Adam Yaseh Zos Adam Yaksik Ba, the man who holds fast to it. And what in particular do you need in order to get God's forgiveness? Which is Shomer Shabbos Mechalel. Now it's very unusual in the Nevi'im that they single out any of the mitzvahs. Right? The Nevi'im are not about actually individual mitzvahs. They don't speak about keep Pesach or keep Bris Milah or keep Kashrus. The Nevi'im don't do that, generally speaking. They give general statements about being loyal to the Torah and being loyal to one's emunah, but Shabbos is the exception. And Yeshaya says, primarily, the key to to standing before HaKadosh Baruch Hu and asking for forgiveness and asking for the redemption and asking for Zachreinu L'chaim, the primary issue that we are going to be judged on, he says, is Shomer Shabbos Mechalelo. That somebody who preserves the Shabbos, Mechalelo. Mechalelo means, right, we speak about Chilul Shabbos. Chilul Shabbos means the violation of Shabbos. So Shomer Shabbos means someone who protects the Shabbos, Mechalelo, from being profane. We protect it, that it isn't desecrated. So protecting the Shabbos and making sure that Shabbos is not desecrated, this is a key to, Yeshaya says, to our standing before HaKadosh Baruch Hu and asking for a geula, asking for Zachreinu L'chaim, Shomer Shabbos Mechalelo. This is so you already see here what's happening. That Chazal understood when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, they want to give a message to the Jewish people, which is, you think that shofar is important? Who doesn't think the shofar is important? Everybody understands that shofar has got a supreme importance in the year, and it calls us to return to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Chazal wanted to say, you think shofar is important? Shabbos is more important. That's really what's going on here. Not having the shofar on Shabbos is a very powerful message. About what? About Shabbos. That Shabbos is the key to what the whole of Rosh Hashanah and Kippur Sukkot, the whole of Tishri, the sanctity of Shabbos, and our efforts to preserve and make Shabbos into a special day and to observe all the prohibitions of Shabbos, that is something of great power. So I want to show you a very interesting Gemara. So this is a Gemara in Shabbos, and the Gemara Shabbos, Daf Kuf Yud Ches, right? In the Talmud Bavli, Daf Kuf Yud Ches. For those who are Daf Yomi people, it wasn't too long ago that we learned Shabbos Daf Kuf Yud Ches. It was only maybe a couple of months ago. And the Gemara says as follows: Omer Reb Chia Ba'aba, Omer Rabbi Yochanan. This was said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, one of the primary authors of the Gemara, and indeed the editor of the Talmud Yerushalmi, one of the great Talmidei Chachamim, actually, who lived in Israel in like the 4th century. Omer Rabbi Chia Ba'aba Rabbi Yochanan. Kol HaMeshabeh Shabbos Kilchosa. Somebody who preserves the Shabbos kehilchato, right, in accordance with its halachot, right? You can see here in the translation, anyone who observes the Shabbos with its halachot. Incidentally, the most famous halachic book on Shabbos was named after this, right? Shmirat Shabbat kehilchato. Shmira Shabbos kehilchoso. There's hardly a Shabbos observant home in the world which doesn't have a copy of Shmiras Shabbos Kilchosa. Shmiras Shabbos Kilchosa is the handbook of Hilchos Shabbos, and written by the late Rabbi Yeshua Neuvet, Zecher Tzarech Livracha, who was one of my Rabbeim. He was a Rebbe of mine, and I actually did smicha with him, and he gave me one of my smichas that I got from Rabbi Neuvet, Zatzal, and for him, Hilchos Shabbos was Kodesh Kodashim, absolute Kodesh Kodashim. I was actually studying as a student of his during the period where he was rewriting the book. He wrote a first edition, and then he wrote a second edition, which is much more detailed and much more, actually interesting differences between the first and the second edition, not a subject for now, but in the second edition, so he was a Talmud, he was possibly one of the closest Talmidim to Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And he used to go and consult Shlomo Zalman every week and discuss and learn with him his whole life. And Rav Shlomo Zalman passed away. I'll never forget that. Rav Shlomo Zalman passed away. Rav Neuvet did Kriya, sat Shiva and did Kriya, even though he wasn't a son, but he was a Talmud. And the halacha is, if you're a Talmud Muvak, you sit Shiva on the passing of a Rebbe. I'd never seen that before, but Rav Neuvet and Rav Shlomo Zalman did Kriya. So this is, he was, and he got the name of his sefer, he got here from this Gemara, Shabbos Kilchosa, Shmir Shabbos Kilchato. So what does the Gemara say? Someone who is Shomer Shabbos Kilchoso, Afilu Oved Avoda Zoro Kador Enosh. Even if he's guilty of what is considered to be in the Chumash, the worst crime possible, which is Avodah Zarah, paganism. There's no single prohibition in the Torah which is repeated so often in such heavy language as that of paganism. We don't relate to it so much today, but that's Avodah Zarah. And so where do they learn it from? From the word Enosh. Okay? The Enosh is a strange word to use for human beings. It should see Bnei Adam, but Enosh was also a person, a human being called Enosh. And Chazal understood that Enosh was the first person to engage in paganism. Because he says here, doesn't he? Ashrei Enosh, the Pasuk in Yeshaya, should really say, Ashrei Odom Yasezos, Uben Odom Yachzik Ba. But before he says Ben Adam, see here he says Ben Adam, but first he says Enosh, Why does he choose the word Enosh? To refer to, Chazal understood, to refer to Avodah Zarah. That even if a person is doing Avodah Zarah, mochlin, he's forgiven. In other words, a person who is Shomer Shabbos Kilchosa gets mechila for even the worst possible transgression, and certainly for all other lighter transgressions. That Shmir Shabbos Kilchoso is a way of attaining mechila from HaKadosh Baruch. And they engage in a little bit of Hebrew word play here. Shenema Ashrei Enosh Yasezos, Shomer Shabbos Mechalalo. So the Apostle says Mechalalo. So the Gemara says, Al Tikro Mechalalo Ela Mochulo. And Mechalalo has actually, if you read it slightly differently, has another meaning to it, which means Machul. Machullo means he's forgiven. So what do we see here from this Gemara, right? You can read it in the English if you can't manage the Hebrew, right? Even if he worships idolatry, like the generation of Enosh, God forgives him his sins. He's forgiven. Why? Because he's a Shomer Shabbos. So the Gemara here is making this point. And I think this is, without a doubt, the background to this most extraordinary halacha. Right? This extraordinary halacha, that comes Shabbos, right? In 3 days' time, it's Shabbos and it's Rosh Hashanah, and we want to blow the shofar, and we say, no, it's Shabbos. It's Shabbos. So on a technical level, the answer is we're afraid that someone might carry the shofar. But on a conceptual level, what we're saying is, however important the shofar is, Shabbos is more important. That's really the most extraordinary message. That Shabbos, we're just so familiar with Shabbos, and we take it for granted. And of course, we try to be Shomer Shabbos to the best of our abilities, right? But being Shomer Shabbos in every detail of Shabbos has a greater power than the shofar. That's what the Gemara is telling us. And that's a most extraordinary message. A most extraordinary message which I think we should be reflecting on. When you sit down with your family to eat on Shabbos, normally we'd be sitting down with I don't know how many guests on Rosh Hashanah. We used to have dozens of guests on Rosh Hashanah. But as you probably know, this year, that ain't going to happen. This is not going to happen, and we're going to be sitting pretty much alone like we did on Seder night because of the lockdown and everything. Very, very sad. Nevertheless, if there's one Dvar Torah you have to say at the table on Shabbos, this is it. Why do you think we don't have a shofar today? It's a mitzvah min ha-Torah to blow the shofar, right? And you should blow the shofar. It should really technically override Shabbos. It should override the Shabbos. It's not an issur. There is no issur to blow shofar on Shabbos, right? And we should do it. Why don't we do it? So at one level, the reason is we don't want to carry. But on a deeper level is to give us this most profound message, which should accompany us through the whole year. Sometimes we become just a bit too accustomed to Shabbos. We take it too much for granted. We don't realize the tremendous power of being Shomer Shabbos. It's a tremendous achievement. Anybody who manages to be Shomer Shabbos properly has achieved a great thing, right? And it should be for us a zechus, for us all the Shabbos that we've kept and all the Shabbos that we plan to keep should be for us a great zechus. And in a sense, we are reminding HaKadosh Baruch Hu on Rosh Hashanah, guess what? We're not blowing the shofar. You told us to blow the shofar. We're not blowing it. Guess what? Why aren't we doing it? It's because we're Shomer Shabbos. So we're reminding HaKadosh Baruch Hu of one of our greatest zechuyot, one of our greatest credits is that we are Shomer Shabbos. And it's something to teach to our children and to teach to our grandchildren the way to be Shomer Shabbos and the tremendous significance of it. And I think there's no greater halacha in the whole year which highlights the significance of Shabbos. There's nothing greater than the halacha, which is not to blow the shofar on Shabbos. That is, in fact, an extremely important point. Okay, we've got 10 minutes left in the shir. I wanted to have a look at something from the Orach Chaim HaKodesh. Orach Chaim HaKodesh is one of my favorite commentators on the Chumash. The Orach Chaim, right? The commentary on the Chumash called the Orach Chaim. If you open the Orach Chaim, you can't understand a word he's talking about, have patience. Go further, because he gets into Kabbalistic pieces which are not really intelligible for non-Kabbalists such as you and me. But there's a lot in the Orach Chaim which is understandable. He was actually one of the Gedolei Yisrael in Morocco in the mid-1700s. He was a contemporary of the Vilna Gaon, a contemporary of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, was a contemporary of the Baal Shem Tov. But unlike the Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon, he actually succeeded in going on Aliyah. The Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon wanted to go on Aliyah, but did not succeed in doing so. He succeeded in coming on Aliyah in the 1700s. If I'm not mistaken, it was even before Nefesh B'Nefesh, right? In the mid-1700s, before the Mishrat HaKlita, and before the welcoming committees at Ben Gurion Airport, he had managed to come from Morocco. It took him, I think, half a year. It took him half a year to come on Aliyah. And today, if you walk in the old city, you're likely to walk through Rehov Orach Chaim. Rehov Orach Chaim is one of the roads going down to the Kaisel, right? And the road was named after this Rav, Chaim Ben Attar, because it has in that street, there is a Beit HaKnesset of the Orach Chaim. Some of you might have gone into it. It's worth visiting. There's a museum there in that Beit HaKnesset of the Orach Chaim. Chaim Ben Attar, one of the Gedolim and great halachic authorities and Kabbalists of the 1700s. And he wrote this most extraordinary sefer on the Chumash, and he's buried on Har HaZeisim. So he's somebody who wanted it all cost. What do you say?
Do you know the nace? Do you know the nace about where he's buried, where they tried to destroy his caver?
I don't know that. Now, who's speaking?
Murray Shore.
Who is talking?
Murray.
Keep it brief, Murray.
They tried to destroy his caver. And if you go visit, you'll see there's a road around his caver. They didn't touch it. All the other kforim around were destroyed after 48, except for the Orach Chaim. I'll give you details later when we talk.
Okay, but it's well known that the Arabs vandalized Har HaZeisim extensively and smashed lots of matzevos and kvarim. And Murray tells us, I was not aware of it, that they tried to vandalize and destroy the kever of the Orach Chaim, but they were not successful. Anyhow, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh was a most remarkable individual and a lover of the land of Israel, and was an important personality in establishing the Yishuv in Yerushalayim in the 1700s. Anyhow, so when he gives his commentary on that piece of Chumash we learned last week, which is Devarim chapter 30, we're speaking about particularly this pasuk. Just to remind you of this pasuk. This pasuk that we learned last week, V'shavto ad Hashem Elokecha, v'shomato b'kola. And this is the prediction. So I mentioned to you last week that this pasuk contains two different aspects of tshuva. One is a mitzvah, v'shavto. The word v'shavto comes from the word tshuva, to return to a spiritual life. But it's also a promise that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a promise from God that eventually there will be a wave of tshuva going through the Jewish people, and there will be a return en masse of Klal Yisrael, a return to their spiritual roots. So he says here, "B'shavtu ad Hashem Elokecha v'shamarta b'kolo." So he says something very interesting. He says, I'll make this relatively brief. So he says there are three different, when we talk about tshuva, there are three different aspects of tshuva, right? I'll highlight the English here for you. When we're referring to tshuva of the Jewish people, there are always three separate dimensions of tshuva to consider. When tshuva here means improving one's life, improving one's spiritual way of engaging with the Torah. So he says there's always three parts to it. And he learns here three psukim in this particular way. The first one is, so he says the first one is Talmud Torah. Right? The first area is Talmud Torah. And he says here, Keneged Teshuvas Talmud Torah, Omar Tshuva Rishono V'Shavto V'Shomato B'Kola, Shehu Talmud Torah. So he learns that this phrase was Shomato B'Kola. Shomato here in this pasuk, it says you should return to Kadosh Baruch Hu B'Shomato B'Kolo. So Lishmoa in classical Hebrew doesn't just mean to listen, it means to understand the Torah. So he says the first thing to do is engage in Talmud Torah, like we do, don't we, Eli? Every Wednesday morning, we get together on Zoom and we engage in Talmud Torah. So the first area of tshuva is to resolve that in the new year, we're going to upgrade, we're going to increase our commitment to Talmud Torah. And I must tell you, incidentally, online, there's the most amazing range of shiurim and Torah available, almost beyond belief. In the history of the world, it's never been easier to hear world-class shiurim on whether it's Gemara or whether it's Hashkafa, Jewish philosophy, Jewish history, whether it's Mishnah or Tanakh. It's extraordinary. And therefore, in our generation, one should be, if you have your computer in front of you and you have a choice between getting onto Netflix or getting onto yutorah.org, so the choice should be to get with the same computer and the same Wi-Fi connection. Instead of getting onto Netflix, you can get onto yutorah.org, and you've got there about 10,000 different shiurim from a couple of hundred different rabbanim on dozens of different topics. And within a couple of minutes, you can choose something fascinating and watch and listen to a shiur. And that's just one of the sites. There's so many different sites like that. So the first tshuva is Talmud Torah, because that's what Shomato B'Kola. The second tshuva is, he says, Umol Hashem Lakachas Levavcha. So the word umol literally means to circumcise your heart, comes the word bris milah, but it means to open your heart. It means to remove the negativity from your heart. So he says the second aspect of tshuva is to refrain from doing averos, refrain from violating the prohibitions of the Torah, refrain from the prohibitions of Shabbos, prohibitions of kashrus, the prohibitions of arayas, all the prohibitions of the Torah. That is the second level of tshuva, right? Keneged shmiras mitzvahs, he says here, Keneged shmiras mitzvahs low task. With regards to being particular, not to violate the Torah in any way, this is umol Hashem Elokecha, right? And then he says, then the last pasuk is, V'ata toshu v'shomata b'kolo v'osisa es kol mitzvos. Here the emphasis is not just shomata b'kolo, which he says is learning Torah, it's v'osisa es kol mitzvos. V'osisa means to perform the mitzvahs haseh. So he says here the third requirement is fulfilling the positive requirements of the Torah. The positive requirements of the Torah, like tefillin, like tzitzis, like kriyas shema, like chesed and staka, these are all mitzvahs asay, right? So this is the Orach Chaim HaKadosh looking at Parshas Nitzavim, understanding that Parshas Nitzavim is the hakdama to Rosh Hashanah, introduction to Rosh Hashanah. So he says a close reading of those psukim gives us an insight into the different aspects of the tshuva that is required of us on Rosh Hashanah. We should have thoughts, please God, towards the new year, of increasing the spiritual content of our lives, our ability to transmit Torah to our children or to our guests or to our friends, to be involved in Talmud Torah, and that is part of the bracha of this type of year. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. We're about to engage in Melech, Ozer, Mashiach, Mogen, the month of Tishri, which is the engine room, spiritually speaking, for the whole forthcoming year. Asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu Zachreinu L'chaim, to remember us for this worldly life and the next worldly life. And I wish you all, Bez Hashem, that we should be written in the Sefer HaChaim, Kasiva, V'chasima Tov. We should all have a good year.